So tell us what we all need to know. And for those who haven't read it and have missed out, let's fill us in.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Alex. As you said, we're here to talk about this report. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, especially you, Alex, but also our co-panelists, Lami and Andrew. It's great to have you virtually here at the Center for New American Security. I'll kick us off by talking a little bit about the report, as Alex said, starting with really why we undertook this project, and then going through a few of our recommendations. And after that, I'll pass it to my co-author, Josh Fitt, to talk through other aspects of the report. So we embarked on this project a little more than a year ago. And at the time, we saw a U.S.-South Korea alliance that was really just emerging from a period of pretty significant turbulence in the relationship under the previous governments in each country. And as we took stock of this emerging kind of new chapter in the alliance, and as we noticed that the alliance was about to mark its 70th anniversary, we saw a series of challenges as well as opportunities for the US and South Korea working together. And so we decided that there were three areas that were relatively understudied and that might benefit from some additional attention and research. So the first area we covered in the report is dealing with the China challenge. This was important, we thought, given that the United States, now considers Beijing its primary foreign policy challenge, and also as threat perceptions about China grow in South Korea. The second pillar of the report is really focused on engaging in minilateral and multilateral groupings. Here we saw the prominence of the U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral, which at the time had not made as much progress as it had now. We also saw the Quad partnership, the AUKUS partnership, as well as fora like the G7 Plus and NATO, and especially South Korea's role in those areas. And then the third area is really about cooperation on military and security technologies, as Alex said. And here we noticed the rapid pace of technological change in military affairs on a range of issues from hypersonic to space. And we wanted to think through what that meant for the alliance as the need to deter North Korea and increasingly China as well becomes more acute. Of course, the threat from North Korea continues to be severe, and all those issue sets that I mentioned above have important linkages to dealing with Pyongyang. But in general, we wanted to look at the with a broader lens, which is why we called the report Peninsula Plus. So in terms of recommendations, I'll go through some four key recommendations key recommendations that were key from my perspective, and then turn it over to Josh for some additional insights. So the first recommendation I want to call the audience's attention to is that we call for alliance managers in Washington and Seoul to identify and build on overlapping priorities in the U.S. and ROK Indo-Pacific strategies. South Korea released its strategy last December after the U.S. released its strategy in February 2022, last February. And we know that there are many shared values and objectives expressed in those strategies. So this recommendation is really about building a work plan for implementation and how do you put meat on the bones of those objectives and make them real out in the world and in the region. Second, we call for broadening the U.S.-South Korea alliance to account more directly for threats from China in addition to North Korea. Of course, deterring aggression from North Korea will always be the primary focus of the alliance. But in terms of addressing the challenge from Beijing, we call on the alliance managers to prepare for really two sets of China-related contingencies. The first set is potential contingencies where China's behavior could affect North Korea, such as if China tried to invade Taiwan and Pyongyang undertook a simultaneous provocation on the peninsula. And the second set of contingencies is one where China might pose a more direct challenge to South Korea's security, including potentially in the maritime space in the Yellow Sea or the West Sea. Third, we say that the United States should encourage Seoul's ambitions as it thinks about moving beyond the Korean Peninsula, while South Korea really has to acknowledge and grapple with the accompanying pressures of carving out a larger global role for itself, but especially the pressures that might come from China. And here we're really saying that, the alliance could really benefit from Korean ambitions to become a global pivotal state, as President Yoon Suk-yeol has articulated. But there also be burdens that accompany carving out that larger global role, and that really has to be accounted for upfront. Fourth, and finally, from my perspective, we called on alliance managers to jointly re-examine from first principles, from the most basic building blocks, all options for bolstering allied extended nuclear deterrence. But, and this is especially for South Korea, we really have to be realistic about the negative potential consequences of drastic changes in nuclear capabilities and posture. And so this recommendation was really meant to address the vibrant discussion in South Korea about extended deterrence broadly and nuclear deterrence and what is required to sustain it more narrowly. I think it's clear to both Washington and Seoul that we need to find a new deterrence division of labor across the conventional and the nuclear spectrum. But the allies really have to, and this is the recommendation, build that out in a rigorous way together, rather than thinking through it sort of unilaterally and then potentially putting forward changes that would have major implications for the alliance. And so those are some of the top lines from me. With that, let me turn it over to my co-author, Josh Fitt, who's an associate fellow in the Indo-Pacific Security Program here. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, Jake, for that great rundown. Greetings, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to our report rollout today. As Jake mentioned, my name is Josh Fitt, and so I'll briefly be covering the recommendations from the two sections of our report that deal with US ROK alignment on minilateral and multilateral initiatives, as well as US ROK cooperation on military and security-related technologies. So first, on mini and multilateral initiatives, we recognize the recent efforts to improve US ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation and recommend new ways to bring it to the next level. So Japan-ROK relations are showing serious signs of improvement. So the trilateral has reached an important moment where there's a real opportunity to recover some of the ground lost since the bilateral ties soured in 2018. Both Yoon and Kishida have taken steps that involve political risk to themselves, and their efforts should continue to receive the support of Washington on that front. Détentes between Japan and South Korea are always fragile. So in addition to the forward-looking attitude that should govern the current approach, leaders of the three countries of the trilateral relationship ought to pursue what could be viewed as weatherproof initiatives, so things that could potentially withstand future bilateral turbulence if it happens again. Additionally, one of our recommendations for the trilateral was that Prime Minister Kishida should invite President Yoon to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, so we were very pleased to hear that the invitation was issued late last month. Our second recommendation on this line of effort is that the United States ought to facilitate South Korea's deeper integration into minilateral coalitions with leading democracies. This includes the G7, as I mentioned above, but also NATO and the Quad. All of these groups represent different opportunities to incorporate Seoul's unique comparative advantages to achieve mutual goals with other like-minded allies and partners. So on the diplomacy front, last week, South Korea also co-hosted the Second Summit for Democracy. And just before the summit kicked off, Yoon and Biden also announced that South Korea would host the third summit next year. So there's clearly an appetite in both directions for those kinds of initiatives. So moving on from that first category of recommendations that I was going to cover, I'll now discuss our recommendations related to US ROK cooperation on military and security-related technologies. So we have three recommendations on this front. First, we recommend that Washington and Seoul compare their defense technology development and acquisition roadmaps to determine where the overlap lies, which could lead to opportunities for sales, co-production, or sharing as appropriate, and simultaneously increasing alliance capabilities overall. The alliance should also use the lines of effort from AUKUS Pillar 2, which encompasses the non-submarine advanced capabilities as a way to identify further high reward overlaps in their priorities. Second, we recommend that the alliance deepen cooperation in the cyber and space domains. So these are two areas where the alliance faces very serious challenges from North Korea and China. The Department of Homeland Security and US Cyber Command have memoranda of understanding in place with their South Korean counterparts, but next steps would include building up AI-based cyber capabilities bilaterally, enhanced threat sharing, including with Japan, and leveraging the new US Space Force Component Field Command within US Forces Korea. Lastly, negotiate a reciprocal defense procurement agreement, which would reduce barriers to greater supply chain integration and logistics support. The United States has RDPs in place with 28 other countries, including NATO and Indo-Pacific allies, as well as some close partners such as Switzerland and Israel. So that wraps up the rundown of our recommendations. Thank you again for your interest in our report. And with that, I will hand things back over to Alex to kick off our panel discussion.
Well, thanks, guys. That was an amazing rundown. I feel like I've read the report again, so it was really helpful and comprehensive. But I do want to bring in two more people who will help us really take this conversation to a different space. So first, Lami Kim, who's the Director of Asian Studies Program at the U.S. Army War College. There she is. And Andrew Yeo, who is a Senior Fellow and SK Korea Foundation Chair at Brookings. I think I nailed the names and the titles, so we can move right along. But I want to turn over to both of you quickly for your short reactions to what you just heard, to the report you've read, and a reminder to our listeners, of course, to send in your questions. But let's start with Lami here real quick. Just have an initial reaction to what you heard from Jake and Josh, and of course from the report itself.
Thank you for having me. And just briefly, I speak for myself, not for the U.S. Army. I really like to congratulate the authors on this, publishing this really comprehensive overview of opportunities for U.S. ROK cooperation. I really like that, and then I assigned it actually for my class as a required reading. And you know, this is a really timely and important piece, not only because this year marks the 70th anniversary of the alliance, but also we now have two leaders in Washington and Seoul that are eager to enhance their cooperation bilaterally and also multilaterally with Japan. And so it's a great timing. I do have some comments. So first of all, though, I am also excited about the recent rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, but unfortunately, I don't think that it can be very optimistic because, you know, really the mutual animosity between the two peoples is really pretty strong. So whatever improvements that we make today under these two administrations would not be sustainable unless we address the root cause of the problem. The, you know, anti-Japanese sentiment in Korea is high, but also anti-Korean sentiment is really high in Japan. So we really have to think about how to address that problem. Secondly, about the nuclear issue, I'm a nuclear scholar, and so I love to talk about nuclear weapons, and that there has been a growing concern about South Korea's development of nuclear weapons. Well, yeah, I understand that there is a strong call for nuclear armament among South Koreans. However, we have to understand that what people want doesn't necessarily translate into government policy. And so I still think that it will be really unlikely that South Korea will actually go nuclear. If you look at what politicians are saying, you know, they're talking about mostly the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons on Korean soil. But actually what people want is the indigenous development of nuclear weapons. So I think that there is still, you know, pretty big gap between what people want and what politicians can even think about today. But anyways, I don't really think that South Korea will go nuclear because it will be really costly. Even if the United States sort of condones South Korea's nuclear development, even just Chinese sanctions against South Korea will be prohibitive enough to, and so it's unlikely. However, still, we have to address South Korea's sense of insecurity, right? How do we do that? That has been a perennial question. That is a hard issue. And then I think that the United States has done a lot militarily, by sending strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. And then I think that we focus too much on military measures, and there are non-military measures that can affect also the credibility of extended deterrence. For example, the recent Inflation Reduction Act, which really shocked the Korean people. They were really betrayed by it. And around that same time, shortly after the Biden administration announced that act, Vice President Kamala Harris visited South Korea, and she visited the ZNZ and all that. But everybody was really focusing on the IRA. And so we really have to think about, this issue more holistically, and think about non-military issues as well. Briefly about I know that this is a conversation. I will stop after this, but about the nuclear power submarine, which is sort of my thing. And so the AUKUS deal, the authors mentioned that South Korea may be able to benefit from the AUKUS deal. And then I think that the report was pretty short, and so you couldn't go deep into it. But I think that what you are saying is that well, this sort of AUKUS deal serves as sort of as a precedent, and South Korea maybe the U.S. will accommodate South Korea's desire to build nuclear power submarines. I sort of disagree because, when Australia has nuclear power submarines, it doesn't really pose proliferation concerns because Australia doesn't really have domestic nuclear base, industrial base or civil nuclear program or expertise or know-how to turn them into nuclear weapons, whereas South Korea does. And so that's why the United States, is against South Korea's development of nuclear power submarines. So we have our reasons. The U.S. has the sort of, I think, reasons why it didn't allow sort of accommodate South Korea's desire for nuclear power submarines. However, from South Koreans' perspective, the AUKUS deal was also a huge shock and betrayal. And so, yeah. So I will stop here, and I will talk more about other things later.
Thank you, Lami. That's super helpful. I've already taken copious notes, so I can sound smart when I grill, especially Josh and Jake on this. But Andrew, real quick, I know you have some reactions to the report as well. If you don't mind walking us through what you got.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. And I also want to commend Joshua and Jake and the rest of the CNAS team for getting this report out as we gear up for a second Biden-Yun summit towards the end of the month. I'm sure they all saw that in their crystal ball that there was going to be a summit, and we're going to release the report right before then. So well-timed, fellows. The report, of course, it was very well organized and it was informative. Even as a card-carrying member of the Korea Watchers Club in DC, I learned a fair amount, especially on the recent developments on the defense technology front. For those that haven't looked at the report closely, there's a terrific table of various dialogues and mechanisms Seoul and Washington have implemented to address bilateral defense technology cooperation. I found it extremely useful, not just about the technology front, but also in reminding alliance stakeholders how frequently the two sides engage in discussion on defense and security matters to address or avoid any potential gaps or cracks in the alliance. I know in the last 6 months, we've been talking a lot about reassurance and extended deterrence. So if you can look at that figure to address or talk about points about reassurance. So a very useful table. I know that there's dozens of issues related to the US-South Korea alliance, which the authors could have selected. And they presumably chose the issues which were not only the most pressing given present security challenges, but would also have a longer term impact on stability in the Indo-Pacific and also on regional order moving forward. And so I think these are really well, I thought that these were excellent issues to address. So we can just review as the issue on the China challenge. It was about minilateralism and multilateralism, and South Korea working together with other allies and partners, and also on defense technology cooperation, which is becoming more and more of an issue as we see developments with Russia's war in Ukraine, as we see China also expanding its own military capabilities. And so it's not just about North Korea, but it's about these broader issues. So I thought that was all terrific. I guess if there was one thing that was missing, and again, it was this report the process began over a year ago, probably economic security issues. I know it's in there. There's discussions about supply chains, about cyber. I always feel like I'm walking on eggshells when I start talking about economic security, because many of us who do traditional security didn't really think about a whole lot about economics until the last couple of years as competition with China has ramped up. But that is probably one significant area that I think is worth discussing. Of course, the report has a limit. You can't discuss everything, but that is one of the issues I think that could be refined a little bit further. On the minilateralism and multilateralism, I thought this was terrific. This is my wheelhouse. I talk about regional architecture, so I was so excited to see this. Lami had already brought up the AUKUS deal and what implications that may have for South Korea. I've also thought, would that bring about the possibility of South Korea gaining nuclear submarines? Because South Korea definitely would like to have nuclear-powered submarines, but there are some challenges, and I think the Koreans did feel, not as I didn't think they felt it as hard as the French did, but I felt like where were we in all this? We have those capabilities, but of course South Korea, the reality is South Korea is limited from moving forward on certain defense technologies because of these agreements. In this case, a nuclear agreement, cooperation agreement with the United States. So that I think that might be something that Alex may want to pick up on. There is one mini-lateral that we don't ever hear about in the United States, but whenever I travel to South Korea, the South Koreans love talking about the AP4. So what the hell is the AP4? It's the Asia Pacific 4, is the four Asian countries, 4 countries in the Asia Pacific that attended the NATO summit. So this would be South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. And I think Koreans feel that there is some promise in developing something there with these other 4 countries. And so that might be something worth paying attention to. But I know that there's so many mini-laterals on the table. For South Korea, it's really playing catch up because they weren't as keen, I think, as maybe other US allies, Australia, Japan, and so forth, in joining these mini-laterals. And so I'm really glad that Joshua and Jacob were able to address this in their report. I'm going to just make one final point, and then hopefully we can open it up to a lively discussion. I think that the issues that face South Korea and the US-South Korea alliance are shared among other allies in the Pacific. That's why we talk about a network, a network of alliances, or intra-network of alliances and partners that the United States can lead. So these problems are shared when it comes to the China challenge, when it comes to economic security, when it comes to coordinating supply chains. But at the same time, we have to remember that South Korea and the US-South Korea alliance also faces a unique challenge because, in part because of the divided nature of the peninsula. And just even if we get back to the issue of North Korea, other allies might see North Korea really as just a security problem. But for South Korea, and also with the US-South Korea alliance, the issue has bigger implications for the future of South Korea, or just Korea, perhaps a unified Korea. But it also has big implications for US force posture, US presence on the peninsula as well, too. So even though these problems are commonly shared, which I think the report would allude to, because when you talk about the China challenge, or minilateralism, multilateralism, or defense technology cooperation, this is something that all US allies are really talking about these days. But we have to remember that how these problems are confronted or viewed, I think from the perspective of the US-South Korea alliance, they may look a little bit different because of the unique, I think, nature of US force presence on the peninsula and because of the divided nature of the Korean peninsula. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it back to Alex. Thank you.
Well, thanks. That was insanely helpful, all of you. First, a quick note is that AP4 is also the name of my K-pop band. So you make sure you check us out. The other thing is I should also note is that, and this is my own little substantive feedback, is any minilateral is also multilateral. There's no need to distinguish between them. Just because there's a smaller amount doesn't mean you have to say it's small. That's all multilateral. I'm just being funny. Anyway, let me throw in just some general sort of top level thoughts here to get us going. But the first, and maybe I'll let Jake start off and respond because it's an implicit criticism of the report, and then we can open it up. But the whole point is Peninsula Plus, right? This is a time to do more, but it feels, it requires a lot in the US. It feels in the US that no one wants to do Plus anymore. The only Plus you're going to pay for is Disney and HBO, maybe. Like no one really wants to do more for Korea. We've got a political environment where, you know, you've got the front runner for the Republican Party, who I believe is doing something else at the moment as we speak, who's been uninterested really in building out that alliance. You've got the current administration that is focused almost solely, not almost solely, but very much prioritizing the military aspect, and the economic aspect is just sort of China focused. All this to say is there a political space right now for Plus? Because it feels like Peninsula Regular is already sort of challenging enough.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question, Alex. And I suppose the way I would respond to it, at least from my perspective, would be to say that I think what's inherent in the concept is this idea that solving challenges on the peninsula can't just be done on the peninsula, right? That whether it's enforcing multilateral sanctions, developing new military technologies that can bolster deterrence with North Korea, it's very, very hard to solve challenges on the peninsula without the Plus. And then likewise, many of the challenges we face, especially in US-China competition, but broadly in the world, you know, there's a lot that the alliance, but especially Korea, can contribute to that area. And so that's from the peninsula out plus to the rest of the world, whether that's on democracy issues, semiconductors, you know, increasingly military sales, those kinds of questions. And so it's not one or the other in my perspective. In terms of support for the US-South Korea alliance in the domestic debate, I tend to think that Donald Trump is sui generis on this one, that he has a unique set of views on this that's certainly not consistent with where the US Congress is, where, you know, they have put into law that, you know, the US will keep 28,500 troops at least on the peninsula, and a broad bipartisan consensus in support of the alliance in general. Now, of course, at the same time, there is this persistent desire for burden sharing that's justified given South Korea's economic success. But you know, I think you see South Korea putting up as much or even more than some other allies do in terms of GDP, in terms of absolute military power, in support of bolstering their own security. And are even looking, I think, to do more. So it's really about how do we work together, both on the peninsula and beyond, to achieve what both the United States, South Korea, and like-minded allies and partners want around the world.
I could just add, that's a great points, Jake. I also think that the plus of the concept of our paper recognizes this central tenet in the Yoon administration's foreign policy that they outlined in their Indo-Pacific strategy of South Korea, like transforming South Korea into the concept of what they call a global pivotal state. It's about South Korea's ambitions to expand their foreign policy focus beyond the immediate periphery of the peninsula, which understandably takes up the vast majority of their attention, at least up until now. And so it's less about, you know, what more can the United States do? I think really a core aspect of this is streamlining South Korea into existing efforts that it's not a part of, that would benefit the grouping, benefit the US-ROK relationship through new vectors of collaboration, and really also add to this transition away from the sort of traditional security architecture in the Indo-Pacific of sort of a hub and spoke system of the United States having a lot of bilateral relationships. Bringing in the plus side of things, in a sense, alleviates a lot of it allows for Washington to focus more on these initiatives that are broader reaching than focusing specifically on the bilateral, while also nurturing the bilateral relationship at the same time.
But continuing my sort of one-man red team here, it almost, I mean, when we're talking about, especially the parts about like technological development, military co-production, I mean, as someone who's tracking, you know, the Ukraine war quite closely, all I keep hearing is we can't make stuff as fast as we need to not only replace what we've given Ukraine, but also to even start conceiving of future designs. I mean, of course, our own contracting process is remarkably slow. I mean, maybe Lami, I'll have you come in here on this and other, or something else, or whoever wants to jump in. But the question I sort of have is, it's all well and good for you know, the U.S. and South Korea to want to do these things. Like, how can it be done when we're already struggling to replace what we're giving Ukraine? And of course, we've got that conflict on our minds for quite some time.
Yeah, well, that is true. I mean, it's problematic that the United States doesn't really have the industrial base to build things, especially build things quickly, weapons quickly. And so I think that there is sort of an opportunity for sort of a division of labor, right? And South Korea can build things, weapons like howitzers, like K9 howitzers and stuff like that, that are maybe not really cutting edge, the highest level of weapon systems, whereas the United States can make more high level cutting edge technologies, such as the global hawks and stuff like that. And so I think that there is a mutual, opportunity for cooperation there.
It may also be that the U.S., I feel like if the U.S. were to shift their industrial production to produce the missiles that are being sent to the Ukraine, these are things that the U.S. would normally not produce. They want to produce things that are future-oriented, what would meet the needs of U.S. national security. So if they can get allies to produce these things while the U.S. still focuses production on the bigger ticket items, the really advanced technology stuff, I think that's where you have the cooperation. So it's not that they're necessarily doing these things jointly, but it's also relying on your allies to fill in the order. Now, there may be a problem because the South Koreans may also see this and say, well, if we are focusing on filling in the back orders for Europeans, or if anything gets to Ukraine, are we meeting our own security needs, especially as we're oriented towards North Korea? So those are some questions I think the two sides would need to hash out. But yeah, in terms of a Peninsula Plus, there are definitely ways where the two sides can strengthen defense technology cooperation.
You know, it feels like there's a weird opportunity here, and I'm probably going to get laughed out of the room for phrasing a question kind of like this, but I don't have Andrew's very laminated Korea Watcher card. But it feels like North Korea is, of course, still testing ICBMs and a whole bunch of things, but no one seems to kind of care anymore in a weird way, right? We don't have, obviously it's not fire and fury, but no one really even seems to be, crying about this, worried about this. I'm sure they are, but it's just not sort of penetrating the zeitgeist. And so while, of course, a big cornerstone part of US South Korea here is worrying about North Korea, it almost feels like there's an opportunity to reorient a little bit towards China, or even more so, because even though North Korea is there, it's just kind of like it's a threat, but we're not really treating it as one or considering it one or having it permeate our narrative. Is that sort of part of what you guys are thinking about here? Is that you can plus at a time when North Korea is there, but not really as top of mind as it has been in recent decades?
I wouldn't put it just that way. I think there's a lot going on in terms of trying to bolster deterrence on the peninsula, whether that's return and even both growing large-scale military exercises to deep integration, interoperability, deploying U.S. strategic assets in and around the peninsula, et cetera. I think the challenge right now with is we're so focused on deterrence piece because the sense of the need to improve deterrence is so strong that there's a lot of demand there. The question is, how do we translate that improved deterrence such that we have it to stability, greater stability, and even providing reassurance, much less finding some sort of diplomatic framework to move to something resembling arms control. And I think that's the place in the agenda where I think most of the Korea watchers with their laminated cards would tell you, we've tried like all the options, right? And so what's the new option or new combination of options that we might be able to try today that's also politically possible, both in Washington and in Seoul, right? I mean, I think really the only option that we've seen that hasn't been tried is basically acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and or doing unilateral removal of sanctions. And I think rightly there's not political support for that in either capital, much less in Tokyo or other places in the region of the world. So that's kind of the basic impasse. And I think part of the reason there isn't a political appetite for that is it's not clear that that would be enough to entice North Korea to actually act in a more constructive way either. So I think that explains some of the lack of attention, if you will, is the sense that we've kind of tried everything and we're out of ideas. So there's probably more work to be done there, but this is well-trod ground, and that's kind of at the heart of the problem.
Can I just jump in quickly? Sitting in the United States, we tend to think that North Korea is not really a big concern anymore, but we have other concerns, China and Russia. But in South Korea, South Koreans are very concerned about North Korea, and especially North Korea seems to be getting pretty close, or North Korea has already acquired the second strike capability against the United States. And then if that's the case, then will Washington come to the aid of South Korea? That really is a big question that a lot of South Korean policymakers are thinking about now. That's why they're talking about nuclear development and all that. And then another thing that I would say is that the strategic stability issue, in a way though, the kind of measures that we take in order to address South Korea's sense of insecurity really exacerbates North Korea's sense of insecurity, right? And so sending strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula and stuff like that, really, it is helpful from South Korea's perspective. But then in this environment, how are we going to have constructive discussions, diplomacy with North Korea? And so those two are sort of not incompatible, but sort of I mean, we have to think about this dilemma.
So maybe one more question, and before I pass it over to the audience, and I please encourage you to keep sending in your questions. And if you want to point it to a specific speaker, please do. But my question is actually inspired by something Lami said in her earlier remarks, which is here we are talking about Peninsula Plus, right? Finding ways to build a greater, build a stronger alliance, find ways to cooperate outside in multiple areas. But we're also at this point, and this relates to my own first question, but we're also at this point in which we're putting out things like the IRA, right? I was in Europe when that came out, and of course the French and the Germans were beside themselves, and of course the Koreans and Japanese and others. How can we sort of build this plus architecture, right, which is really about sort of mutual convenience, when it feels increasingly, not completely, but increasingly, there's a bit of like America doing things on its own, creeping into, which is the other pillar of this, which is the economic side. How do you sort of overcome that, this sort of new political economic moment that we're in?
I'll speak to that just very quickly, and just Andrew mentioned earlier the kind of economic security piece of it, and we think that's vital. Josh and I, along with our colleagues Alexander Sullivan, wrote a report last year called Digital Allies that really focused a lot on chips and batteries and those kinds of elements of the alliance that obviously, there's a lot that's happened in the intervening time, but just to say that that's a critical area. I think what happened with the IRA is a reflection of American domestic politics, and the fact that that bill came together in a reconciliation process where they were barely getting the domestic actors on board, much less kind of workshopping it with allies. And that's just a quirk of our system, but I don't think it wasn't intended as a slight to South Korea, Japan, Europe, any other suppliers around the world, but was definitely taken as such. I think you've seen the administration work really hard to try to repair that and fix that. And my understanding is they've made some progress even in the last few days in terms of the implementation of the IRA and how some of the rules about origins of batteries in cars and stuff like that are interpreted in the U.S. government. So I think they've done some remediation of that sense, but I think it shows that and we've seen that in the semiconductor space as well. But I think it shows that challenge and trade-off that you're referring to is the need to be constantly consulting and balancing some of the trade-offs of how do you support climate goals at home and domestic industry, which also happens in South Korea, also happens in Europe, with what's going on in your alliance politics. And it's going to be a continual challenge. But I think at the same time, you saw the Moon Biden summit early. You saw the Biden-Yoon meeting for the earliest time that the two leaders had ever met in a South Korean presidency, an upcoming state visit. There's clearly an investment in the alliance, at least coming from the administration. And I think I think those offset each other. I hope they would offset each other.
I think another aspect that can sometimes complicate the issue is, of course, when we're talking about the private sector and the private sectors in different countries, even allied countries, the major companies are in competition with each other. That's the nature of the capitalist system. So in a zero-sum situation, it can be hard to kind of navigate that aspect of it. Just in response to the other part of your question, I would point to something like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as an example of something that the administration is doing that specifically is seeking input from the partners in the region. I mean, I think a common criticism of IPEF is that it's vague and undefined, but I think that's by design because the entire point of it is to have consultation with the partners and try to understand the common ground of what would be mutually beneficial to all the parties.
Yeah. Can I just weigh in really quick here as well too? And I have a slightly different take. I absolutely agree with Jacob and Joshua here that I think the administration has done a pretty good job of, the Biden administration that is, has done a pretty good job of trying to navigate between the domestic politics and also the domestic politics of implementing its foreign policy goals, which requires support for allies. But there has been some mixed messaging, I think. The Inflation Reduction Act has been one of them. I don't think the US had anticipated that strong of a backlash from South Korea, and they have tried to work with the Koreans on the implementation side to ensure that, for lack of a better term, that the South Koreans aren't getting hosed or on the shorter end of the stick of this deal. But on something like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, yeah, there has been criticism that it's a bit amorphous, ambiguous. But I think the biggest criticism has been the lack of any kind of market access for allies, and that's something that Asian allies or Europeans as well too are trying to seek. And so it is this balancing act that the Biden administration is playing, but in doing so, it sometimes sends mixed signals, and so there is a bit of uncertainty in where the Biden administration is heading in terms of its policy and its commitment to allies. I'll stop there.
So actually, this brings up something that maybe Andrew, you can quickly follow up on. When President Yoon is reading Jake and Josh's excellent report on the flight over to see President Biden, what is he most going to agree with? Like, which initiative that they're proposing is he most going to agree with, and which is the one he's going to probably balk at the most?
I mean, I think in general he'll agree with all, because he talks about this global pivotal state. I would say in terms of the recommendations, maybe on the China piece as well. And I think that's because the Koreans themselves haven't really quite figured out what to do on China. Yes, they want to be on board with other allies and partners, but in terms of, I'm trying to find the actual point in the printout. I can't see it right now, but in terms of further cooperation, doing any sort of exercises with the U.S. Or orienting the alliance towards China challenges, that may be tricky, especially on the Taiwan question. That's something that I would like to see happening in the DC and among allies, about having more of a conversation on contingency plans for the Taiwan Strait. But that's something that the Yun government itself hasn't really been that willing to talk about publicly. So I think they may feel a little bit, they may have some reservations from the report on the China part, even though here in Washington, we feel that these are all the things that should be taking place. We should be having more conversations about China or contingency on Taiwan and so forth.
Lami, was there anything, do you agree with that, or do you have a different
I totally agree with that. I mean, so we, of course, President Yoon Suk-yeol is far more willing to cooperate with the United States in countering China, but still, we have to understand that South Korean leaders, have a pretty small maneuvering space. I mean, China is an very important economic partner, and also China is important for addressing North Korea issues. And so really, Taiwan contingency is really not a concern for most South Korean people. When we talk about, security issues with Koreans, Taiwan doesn't really come up. And then another thing that probably President Yoon may not agree, not necessarily not agree, but I mean, one thing that is not really going well, in my opinion, when it comes to like tech cooperation between the two countries, is that the emerging tech issue, like a cyberspace, artificial intelligence, and nuclear, and those things. There's been a lot of talk, but not enough action. And as Joshua mentioned earlier, like two governments agree that they have to collaborate in developing these new technologies, especially before China takes advantage of, sort of first comer advantages. However, private companies are in competition, and South Korea has pretty sophisticated technologies in some areas, in some cases, even more advanced technologies than the United States. And so, and I don't really think that there has been much cooperation, like, in a really tangible way.
Yeah, Alex, if I can add to that, I mean, I think on China, my perception is the Yoon administration has largely defined its China policy so far in opposition to the Moon administration, right? Saying that it's not about balancing between the US and China anymore. It's not about retaining their version of strategic ambiguity, not the US strategic ambiguity related to Taiwan, but rather, making clear that South Korea is, at least going to lean, if not fully, stay in the camp of the United States and sort of liberal democratic powers. And they've rejected the three no's, not agreement, but kind of tacit agreement with China, but also not taking any steps, policy steps to violate that, right, at the same time. And so what the term we use in the report is cautious counterbalancing. They're always, as Lami said, always going to have to be incredibly cautious because of their geographic position, their middle power status, and the deep integration with China's economy. Although some folks who know the trade and economic picture a little bit better than I do say that some of those trends are shifting because as China moves up the value chain, there's a lot going on in terms of supply chains between China and South Korea. But I would just say one more thing on that middle power piece. I think this is a place where, South Korea, and it would benefit the alliance, but for South Korea to do more consultations with its middle power colleagues. And that's a place where the AP4 with NATO, with Japan, the Philippines, Australia, thinking about what kind of strategies can middle powers undertake to improve their position vis-a-vis China, to resist coercion more effectively, especially economic and political coercion. There's a lot of space for South Korea to work there. And I think that's one of those places where the notion of a global pivotal state, or even just a more global Korea, can be linked back to kind of core political and economic and security interests for Korea itself, which would advantage the alliance as well.
Well, all right, let's go to the smart people who are listening to us. Enough of my questions, and I apologize, I only have your first names here, but let's start with, and this is not directed to anyone in particular, but this is from Corey. Are there concerns among European allies in the Indo-Pacific of overcommitting to South Korean security needs over the needs of other countries? Anyone have an initial reaction to this?
There could be. I haven't seen it. There should be more thinking about there. I would expect there structurally to be more thinking about this, but I haven't seen it voiced from anyone I've spoken to.
I haven't heard any concerns among allies that there's too much being committed to South Korea. I mean, everyone is aware that North Korea is a really it's an increasing problem, and so there needs to be some resources. But we also see allies are stepping up themselves. I look at Japan. Japan in some ways is taking matters into its own hands as well too. So and there's more cooperation with Korea as well. So so far I haven't seen any complaints from allies. If anything, there's some complaints from those on more of the progressive spectrum, thinking that there's just overcommitment in general to everything in the Indo-Pacific and it's being over-militarized, but that's a completely different question.
I think where this might come out is, there are, of course, as we've mentioned, among certain allies or groups, voices within allied countries about questions about, U.S. commitments. I don't think it's necessarily in response to a specific alliance like the US-ROK alliance, for example. If there are concerns in Japan, I don't think it's necessarily geared towards South Korea. But on the other hand, I think there's a broad-based understanding that the guarantees that the United States offers to its treaty allies go far toward proving the legitimacy of the U.S. security guarantee, and that spreads to other countries as well, and improves the ability of the United States to act as a stabilizing force in the region.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, I have heard Europeans complaining that Washington is too focused on China, but in the Taiwan contingency, but not Korea.
European governments never complain. Maybe this one is for Josh and Lami a bit, but anyone, of course, can weigh in. This is from Wyatt, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but basically, does the announcement of the 4 EDCA sites in the Philippines, does that play into the larger deterrence picture on the Korean Peninsula?
I can take a swing at this. So they announced I think it was yesterday, the locations of the 4 new Edco facilities in the Philippines. 3 of them are in Luzon on the northern half of the island, very close to Taiwan, 4th on Palawan. That adds to the 5 current Edco facilities. And these are basically logistics and staging facilities that the United States Armed Forces can use with in agreement with the Philippines Armed Forces. I think the view is that these facilities are part of spreading out the force structure in a way that could react adaptively to a variety of contingencies. Andrew mentioned that there ought to be greater alliance contingency planning in relation to a Taiwan scenario. I completely agree, but I think something that people are starting to think of more is also what would happen in kind of a dual Taiwan, North Korea scenario. I think in that situation, having these locations in the Philippines a bit further away from the vicinity of where a lot of this might be taking place would be a huge benefit to the logistics ability, which in turn in peacetime obviously reflects a strong deterrence posture.
Yeah, can I just add real quick? Oh, sorry, Lami, go ahead, please.
Oh, no.
I would just add real quick. I mean, I think a lot of what you're seeing, whether it's from the Philippines, Japan, Australia. And I think this logic would apply to South Korea too, is not what do you contribute to a Taiwan contingency in support of the US or Taiwan, although that's important, but what does a Taiwan contingency mean for your own security? And if something happens in a Taiwan contingency, what does that mean about your own and a U.S. allied context ability to protect your own country? And so, and thinking back along that logic chain, what's it worth doing then to prevent that outcome? And I think that's the kind of hard-nosed security calculations a lot more countries in the region are making. I think most forward-leaning way in Japan, but increasingly in the Philippines as well. And I think that has some explanatory power for AUKUS. And the Taiwan conversations I've had in conjunction with South Korean counterparts is really about, not about what will South Korea contribute to defending Taiwan, but what U.S. forces could stay on the peninsula for a deterrent effect. What sort of rear operations might have to happen in Korea for U.S. forces in that context. Just access in general to the areas around Korea that might increasingly be contested. All those kind of nuts and bolts operational questions that flow from what a Taiwan contingency means for the region. To me, that's what's driving a lot of other decisions among especially U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific.
I will take credit as moderator for having steered the conversation this direction with a brilliant segue. But this will be our last question of the day from Richard. Since we end in about 2 minutes, this will have to be quick. But the basic question is there any room for potential Taiwanese involvement or cooperation in any of these Peninsula Plus efforts? Andrew, we hadn't heard from you in a bit. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Sure. That's an excellent question. We usually hear whether Koreans can contribute to a Taiwan contingency, but not the other way around. I think it's just because of the sensitivity of the question. I would say to begin with, we could do it at a track 2 level, because I think it's important for the Taiwanese to be engaged in conversations, especially if you see contingencies linked. For example, Koreans think that if you send US troops to Taiwan, that leaves a vulnerable space for South Koreans. So would the Taiwanese recognize that? And if there's any contingency on the Korean Peninsula, how would that affect the Taiwanese? So there is room for conversations. I think it should begin at the track 2 level, maybe a bit too early or too sensitive to do it at the government-to-government level, but certainly I would like to see those sort of conversations happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be just too provocative and too risky. And I don't really think that is a good idea, especially we can't talk about economics, cooperation. I mean, if the US is already doing that, the Cheap 4 Alliance and all that, but security cooperation, especially if you're talking about military exercises and stuff like that, that would be just too provocative.
Yeah, I think most of it would have to be done at that truly multilateral level and probably mostly outside the security space, as Lami said, already happening in Chip 4, but also areas like APEC where Taiwan, is a member. And then thinking about, is there complementarity between efforts? For example, IPEF and the more bespoke trade agreement that the US and Taiwan are working together is the way to harmonize those when they're done, even if it's not a formal linkage.
Well, all right. We could have this conversation for much more time, but there's unfortunately we are out of it for now. I want to thank Jake. I want to thank Josh. I want to thank Lami. I want to thank Andrew, who's going to make sure we all have laminated Korea Watcher cards after this session.
If you show us your AP for K-pop dance, you definitely get one.
Off camera for sure. But thanks to all of you watching. Yes, you watching. Thanks for joining. CNAS has way more events for you guys to check out, so please do. I'm Alex Hort of POLITICO, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.